11 kwietnia 2024 roku, Kraków, godzina 18. Przy mikrofonie Jan Grabowski i Simon Sebag Montefiore, autor wielu rewelacyjnych książek, które zostały wydane w 35 językach. W pamięci polskich czytelników zapisał się m.in. za sprawą biografii Jerozolimy oraz biografii Stalina. W tym roku nakładem wydawnictwa Znak Horyzont do rąk czytelników został oddany pierwszy tom najnowszej książki Simona pod tytułem Świat, Historia Rodzinna. Jako autor jesteś przede wszystkim kojarzony z omawianiem przeszłości przez pryzmat wielkich historii. Tym razem podjąłeś najbardziej ogólny, wydawać by się mogło, niemożliwy w realizacji temat, jakim jest historia świata. Skąd pomysł na tego typu krok?
This is indeed a pretty difficult subject. In my career it's been the most challenging but also the most exciting thing I've ever done. And you're right, it was pretty daunting. What I wanted to do was to find a way to combine the span of world history, real world history, with the intimacy, the real grit of human life. Because a lot of biographies are very long and very detailed, but lack what you might call perspective. And a lot of world histories are amazingly epic and sweeping, and yet the human beings are sort of missing. So I wanted to find a way to combine the two. And I finally discovered what I thought was a way to do it. To use family, the basic unit of human life, family, the preponderant form of government in world history, to tell the story and to bring it to life. And what I wanted to do was to create a world history that was all of world history, all continents, all nations, all peoples, all religions, all times, and all in one narrative. And so also I wanted to make sure that it was readable by everybody. So this book isn't just meant for scholars, or like all my books. I really worked extremely hard to make sure that it's scholarly. It's based only on authoritative sources, and yet it can be read by anybody. That's the idea.
Napisanie historii świata z jednej strony oznacza sporą swobodę, a z drugiej na pewno wiąże się z pewnymi wyrzeczeniami, koniecznością zrezygnowania z jakichś aspektów przeszłości. Czy byłbyś w stanie wskazać coś, czego w twojej książce z różnych powodów zabrakło?
Oh, well, it's so difficult to write a book like this. I mean, all history books are works of selection, and one has to be so ruthless, but in this book particularly, it's so hard because one of the things I wanted, it had to be a book that had narrative velocity and had power, and that meant that it could not just be an encyclopedia of everything that's ever been. And so there were things that I had to miss out. And in fact, it's always said that to be a great statesman, you have to be able to drown puppies. And it's the same with a historian. So this has all sorts of things I'd love to have put in, but couldn't. A lot of the history of Holy Land, for example, I'd love to have put in because I knew so much about it. A lot of the history of Russia, Madagascar, Thailand. But always I had choices. I had to make choices and couldn't put everything in. For example, I couldn't put in Ghana and Nigeria. I had to choose one. I couldn't put in Thailand and Cambodia. I had to choose one. And so I made ruthless choices. In Yugoslavia, I had to choose one part of Yugoslavia, or Albania, and I chose Albania. So all the time I was facing difficult choices. In Poland, I put in less about the Piasts, for example, and more about later monarchs and leaders like Pilsudski or Jan Sobieski. But all the time I was facing these terrible choices. And to this very day, this question that you've asked me causes me great pain. Let's carry on. Let's move on to something else quickly.
Z przedstawianych przez siebie historii w oczy rzuca się jedna rzecz. Niemal każda dynastia była uwikłana w zbrodnie lub inne niecne praktyki. Czy to oznacza, że nie da się rządzić uczciwie?
Well, I think it was the great Gibbon who said in his History of the Roman Empire that history is just a chronicle of crimes and appalling acts. And in some ways it is. But I hope that's not completely true in this book, because I've taken real trouble to also to chronicle stories of loving families, of love, of literature, of music. It's all in here. But of course, it's the terrible massacres and tortures that everyone remembers. And by the way, of course, when one talks about ruling families, yes, the rivalries in these dynasties are brutal. Wherever you are in the world, power is a messy business. But of course, it's not just power families that that's true of. We all know from our own families that every family is filled with feuds and jealousies. It's just that in power families, the stakes, the means available as well, are so much higher.
Czy dyktatorzy tak dobrze znani z XX wieku mieli swoje odpowiedniki w przeszłości? Czy różni ich jedynie technologia? Czy może faktycznie XX wiek był ewenementem, jeśli chodzi o historię zbrodni i terroru?
Yeah, I mean, of course, the dictators of the 20th century were in some ways unique, because they had trains and machine guns, which meant that they could kill people that much more quickly. But on the other hand, when you read about Genghis Khan taking the city of Merv, for example, which was a huge capital city of 1 million people, if you know what you're doing, you can massacre an entire city of 1 million people in an afternoon, and that's what he did. And so that really that's the sort of chastening fact you'll find in the book, I'm afraid. But equally, people always felt that the people in their own time were the worst available. For example, Nicholas I, the Tsar of Russia, Emperor of Russia, was described as Genghis Khan with a telegraph. Stalin was described by Trotsky as Genghis Khan with a telephone. So who knows? Who the next monster will be Genghis Khan with WhatsApp or something. So there's always technology, but in any age there's always the will and the means to kill. And I'm afraid that's true of all times, not just our own.
Dyktatorzy nigdy nie są odpowiedzialni za pełnię zbrodni. Zawsze dysponują gronem osób, które sieją terror w ich imieniu. Gdybyś miał sporządzić ranking najbardziej krwawych asystentów, kogo byś wymienił? Pozwolisz, że ze swojej strony rozpocznę zestawienie od Mikołaja Jeżowa. Większego psychopaty chyba nie można znaleźć.
Yes, and that's one of the most important themes, not just in this book, The World, but in all my books, like the Romanovs and the Stalin books. The point is that none of these leaders, these psychopathic dictators, are alone. All of them function with a huge staff of helpers, and that goes from their top henchmen, who are magnates, potentates in the regime, all the way down to the people who are brushing the floors and making and organizing the paperwork, and they all bear responsibility. And of course, it's impossible to name them all. It's impossible to indict them all. It's impossible to try them all. But one of the things that we need to do with these dictators, and which I try and do in my books, is not just to say they were bad, but to show how human they were, how easily they persuaded people to join them, how they persuaded them, how the regime worked. And in my Stalin book, for example, there are letters after letters of Stalin writing to his top people, trying to persuade him to follow them, and offering them also the benefits that any politician would offer them, cars and houses, in order that they would take the jobs he wanted them to and follow the policies he wanted. There's no point in studying Hitler or Stalin and just saying they were monsters. That's meaningless. We have to understand, and historians have to show, how this functioned, how they gained the power they did, and how people followed them. And one's got to realize, I think, that psychopaths are pretty common. Psychopath just means someone with no moral sense at all. And there are a lot of people like that. In fact, every office has one, at least one. Many offices have more than one. And so, yeah, Yezhov is one of those, and he's an interesting character. There were times when he was seeing Stalin several times a day, every day, and but he was also an example of someone who couldn't take the heat. He was promoted very fast by Stalin. He was very young. He was only in his 30s, and suddenly he had this responsibility. He became terrified by it, and he began to sink into drunkenness, into depravity, into sexual adventurism, and ultimately he destroyed himself by plotting against Stalin. And Stalin sacrificed him, of course, and he was executed. But he's an interesting example. Even in the world, which has, of course, much bigger span and therefore less detail, I've tried, where necessary, to name such people and to indict those who are responsible.
Należysz do specyficznego grona historyków, którzy nie znają ograniczeń terytorialnych. Badasz najbardziej odległe cywilizacje, zarówno pod względem historycznym, jak i geograficznym. Czy prowadzisz w tym celu specjalne przygotowania, na przykład starasz się poznać kulturę i mentalność danego narodu? Napisałeś kilka książek związanych z Rosją. Jesteś Anglikiem. Rosja to dla ciebie drugi koniec świata, a jednak zrozumiałeś rosyjską mentalność w sposób bezbłędny.
That's a very nice thing for you to say, thank you. I'm most touched, and in fact I'm most touched by everybody here in Poland who've been so welcoming to me. You know, I think the key to understanding the history of foreign worlds, whether it's writing about Stalin and his people, or the Romanov dynasty, Catherine the Great, all those kind of rulers of Jerusalem, the rulers of the Middle East, is that you have to realize, one, you have to approach the whole subject with great humility and humbleness, and realize that, you know, oftentimes we don't even know people that we live with. And so people in another world, even quite recently, like the Stalin group, for example, we don't know anything about how they really thought. They thought in a different way. Just because they looked like us doesn't mean that mentally they were in the same world. And so when I start, I always begin by reading as much of what they've written as I can, reading about them, reading what people said about them, reading what they read, and trying to understand that what their mindset was, what their mental landscape was, what their mental galaxy was. And for example, with the Bolsheviks, they were as foreign to us as members of an Islamic jihadist terrorist organization, or people in the Middle Ages, or people in the ancient world. They existed in a different world to us, and we had to understand it. They spoke Bolshevik. They thought Bolshevik. So that's what I did with the Stalin books. Was I just started from the beginning and I approached it completely differently, like I didn't know anything, like I'd never known anything. I did the same with Catherine the Great and Potemkin. And with Jerusalem, writing a history of the Middle East, you cannot write a history of the Middle East if you're kind of slightly contemptuous of religion, for example. Because then it's all meaningless if you don't understand why people believe in religions. And so that was also essential for that work. In the 18th century, writing about Poland and Russia and the Catherine the Great period, you had to understand what they read in the Enlightenment. They lived through the Enlightenment. That was the most influential lodestar for them. So in everything, I just try and start from scratch, from the beginning, and try and work out how they thought. And I was very lucky also with the Stalin book, because I met people from every one of the leading families, the children of Mikoyan and Molotov and all these people. I met them, talked to them for a long time, and then I realized that I was right in the way I was describing Stalin's court.
Na to pytanie odpowiadałeś pewnie dziesiątki razy, ale mimo wszystko pozwolę sobie je zadać. Czy uważasz, że Rosja ma szansę na zmianę? Czy jest skazana na wieczny absolutyzm i dyktaturę?
Well, I'm a sort of optimist. I'm a sort of pessimist optimist. I mean, I'm always the chronicler of the darkest of times and the darkest of people. And many people think I'm a cynic. But I'm also a romantic optimist about human nature. And I believe if you look at history, worlds fall all the time, states fall, nations change, cities collapse, and all the time massive changes happen in the mentality and attitude of peoples. So though I believe that Russia will be a dictatorship for some time to come, I would never believe that it's impossible that Russia could change and become a democracy. And I think as a democracy, it would be one of the most powerful countries on earth. And I think it would be a massive success as a democracy. So I live in hope. And I'm an optimist about many things, even peace in the Middle East. But nothing happens overnight either.
Kryzys dynastii, rodów po I wojnie światowej pozostawił w ogólnoświatowym systemie władzy lukę, którą wypełnili politycy, populiści i dyktatorzy. Ci najbardziej znani, jak Hitler i Stalin, nie pozostawili potomków, którzy kontynuowaliby ich władzę, ale są przecież inni, którym się to udało. Czy byłbyś w stanie odnieść się do współczesnych rodów, które dzierżą władzę, a przy okazji stanowią realne zagrożenie dla świata?
Yeah, when I wrote the book, of course, I was anxious that my system of writing about world history would be difficult after 1918, because in 1918, as you know, all the great imperial dynasties, the Ottomans, the Hohenzollerns, the Habsburgs, fell from power, and I worried that that I would have to end the book early, or would I be able to continue? But actually, looking at people's families is always relevant, even if they are people who, in public, eschew the importance of family. And Hitler, as you know, always said, "I'll never marry. I'm married to the Volk, the people, the German people." Stalin and all the Soviet leaders kept their private lives very private and secret. And part of the reason Stalin did that was to create mystery about himself. And yet families also played a part in creating them. And by the way, you'll be surprised to hear this from me, but I think that some of the way that people apply Freudian psychobabble to the biography of great politicians is often preposterous. And it used to be said, for example, that Hitler and Stalin became mass murderers because their fathers beat them, which is just ridiculous. Because in those days, everybody's father beat them, and that their fathers were alcoholics. Well, both their fathers drank heavily, and in those days, everyone drank heavily. In Hitler's case and in Stalin's case, what was much more important was the favor of a mother, and the love of a mother, perhaps the excessive love, the indulgent love of a mother. And again, lots of people are loved by their mothers and don't become Hitler or Stalin. But what their mother's love did give them, which is interesting, is not just self-confidence, not the inferiority complex that's always stated in cliched histories of Hitler and Stalin, but a superiority complex, that they were superior to everybody and knew better than everybody. And the effect of that, when it works, when it fails, you just become one of those ridiculous characters on The Apprentice or one of these TV reality shows. But when it works, it's self-fulfilling, and more people take you and take you at your own estimation. So yes, they didn't have families, but they're still possible to analyze their courts in the same way as you would analyze a royal court, as I did in Stalin, the Court of the Red Tsar. And of course, afterwards you asked the families today. We've never seen more family power since the days of the monarchies in Europe before 1918. Of course, we live in very sort of secular, rational countries like Poland and Britain and the United States and Canada, where we pride ourselves on holding family power at bay. And in fact, many of our institutions in our republics, like America, like Poland, are designed to stop that sort of what we regard as corruption, patronage, and so on, which is typified by dynastic favoritism and nepotism. But actually, even in Western countries, there's a huge amount of nepotism. There's a huge amount of hereditary power. And you only have to look at all the American dynasties, which are not just on the presidential level, but also if you look at governors, if you look at senators, if you look at congressmen, there's a huge, many of them are the sons and grandchildren of other congressmen and senators and governors and so on. That's even more true in places like India and Japan. So basically, you have 4 types of hereditary power now. First of all, you have the constitutional monarchies like we have in Britain, which works very well, in fact. It's idiosyncratic, but somehow it works. The second type is what I call, I call them demo dynasties, elected families. I mean, very recent examples, the Roosevelts, the Bushes, the Clintons, the Kennedys in America, the Nehrus in India, and so on. In Singapore, the Lee family, and so on, who are elected. In theory, you get the experience of a hereditary ruler, but you can get rid of them whenever you like. That's the good thing. And there are many of them. They just elected a Marcos in Philippines. They elected a Kenyatta in Kenya, and I could go on. Third, though, the absolute monarchies of mainly of the Middle East, Thailand and the Middle East. And they've never been more powerful and more important. They've never been richer. Saudi Arabia, of course, is the most prominent. And MBS is the most dynamic of these rulers. And lastly, you have what I call republic dynasties or republic monarchies. They look like a republic. They have a presidency, but in effect, they're really hereditary monarchies. And that really affects much of the world outside Europe and North America. Many of the countries in Africa. The president of Uganda has just named his son as head of the army and successor. Cambodia, the prime minister, the dictator's just made his son prime minister. Look at Pakistan. The new government is completely made up of dynasties. Same with Bangladesh, daughter of the founder of Bangladesh. So these countries are now surging and becoming much more common. Of course, the most prominent of them all is the Kim family of North Korea. And they're the most powerful family in the world because they have their own nuclear arsenal.
Czy dyktatorzy trochę się zmienili? Nie sposób odebrać władcom Korei Północnej miana dyktatorów, a jednak wydaje się, że są nieco bardziej łagodni, a swoje ambicje mieszczą w granicach państw, którymi rządzą. Czy jest to sytuacja przejściowa, czy może faktycznie pewne mechanizmy wypracowane po II wojnie światowej są skuteczne?
Of course, all leaders are limited by the power of their countries. And though, for example, North Korea has nuclear weapons, it has far fewer nuclear weapons than any of the countries around it, China, Russia, and the United States. So, of course, they are limited, and they're constantly trying to increase their powers. I think, in answer to your question, I think the rules of World War II are finished. We're now in a new world. I think the 70 years, well, the first 50 years after World War II, it was really like a game of chess, of 2 key players, and the calm rules of chess. The next part was the American paramountcy. That was like a game of solitaire. America was playing it on its own. Everyone else was watching and waiting for America. And America overplayed its hand massively. And now we're in a multiplayer computer game with many, many smaller players. So you're right, that's the future. The future is what I call the continental powers, the many smaller countries that are now following their own interests and their own foreign policies. in all sorts of conflicts and all sorts of regions and outside their own immediate neighborhood. That's a new thing. And that's why the world at the moment is an unpredictable kaleidoscope.
W okresie zimnej wojny bardzo interesującym zjawiskiem był tzw. Doomsday Clock, czyli zegar zagłady, za sprawą którego wyznaczano ryzyko wybuchu wojny atomowej. Im mniej minut dzieliło nas od północy, tym bardziej niebezpieczna była sytuacja na świecie. Ile twoim zdaniem minut dzieli nas obecnie od północy?
I don't think we're close at the moment on the Doomsday Clock. But I do think that nuclear weapons now, we're in a more dangerous time than we ever have been before. And I mean, part of the reason is, of course, we know there are sort of 8 or 9 nuclear powers. But of course, many powers have peaceful nuclear programs that could quite quickly be converted into nuclear weapon systems. So actually, potentially, we're in a much bigger situation of proliferation than it appears. If Iran gets those weapons, then Saudi needs to get the weapons. And of course, Saudi isn't necessarily stable either. So we are in a dangerous position. And yeah, I mean, the doomsday clock is ticking again.
Czy nie uważasz, że wszystko może się znudzić, w tym również pokój?
Peace can get boring, and that's why you see in the Western countries now these progressive, supposed anti-racist movements, but these progressive movements that are shaking up society, attacking institutions, demanding that they be decolonized or cleansed in some way. That is why there is all this friction, these culture wars. And the reason for culture wars are a complete luxury. They're a sign that they're a disease of success. Only in very, very well-off countries can you afford such crazy, time-wasting turbulence. And this is a good place to finish, perhaps. Chairman Mao, who knew about such things, he said peace is boring, war is exciting, and everybody craves the excitement of war and revolution.
It was my last question. Thank you very much for the interview.
Thank you very much for me, and really nice to talk to you and lovely to meet you.
W dzisiejszym odcinku pragniemy serdecznie pozdrowić panie Annę Unruk-Cichoń, Justynę Stopińską, Urszulę Babiuch, Ewę Ogrodnik, Ewę Pielichowską oraz Małgorzatę Gos. A ponadto panów Mateusza Szenderę, Tomasza Sadurskiego, Radosława Kuśmierza, Damiana Dziedzica, Piotra Borkiewicza, Kamila Kubowa, Huberta Kędziorka, Dariusza Stelmaczonka, Adriana Flora, Piotra Kośmidera, użytkownika Dźwiedziu, Huberta Walasa i kanał Good Times, Bad Times, Pawła Łabno i Rudolfa Miczkę. Ty również możesz mieć wpływ na tworzone przez nas materiały. Dołącz do nas już dziś na platformie Patronite.
Zachęcamy do obserwowania naszych pozostałych mediów społecznościowych, na których znajdziecie wiele dodatkowych treści, ciekawostek, zapowiedzi odcinków i materiałów zza kulis.